Do you guys feel like the reason you named them Dawn and Sunrise and Daylight not only was that you think you're going to transform DeFi, but also for the protocol itself to reinvent or reintroduce itself to the world of DeFi? Is that kind of where internally you guys are thinking about it?
There's no question. And there's also no question we have a big chip on our shoulder.
Nice.
Uh, we Bancor was the first DeFi protocol created, potentially the the key and core building block of the entire space, and is routinely overlooked. And this is something that I could talk for hours about, whether it's us showing Vitalik the AMM model that we had and him wanting us to use ETH in the pools and then funding Uniswap and all the and then promoting Uniswap and all the regulatory stuff that we couldn't talk about in the beginning and just recently started getting clarity on. And so there's 1,000 reasons we can talk about why Bancor was first, but it doesn't matter who's first. It matters who offers the best product. We think today we do offer the best product and the most sound economics and protocol. And still the Bancor is just routinely overlooked.
Yeah.
And so I fully agree with you, Brad, that this is a coming out party for us. We have some folks on the marketing side and then having brilliant minds like Mark leading research and coming up with these incredible designs, scaling the number of full-time contributors on the engineering side and be able to move faster, eventually going to different chains and L2s, and also having our pool tokens be composable, whereas in V2.1, they weren't composable. They were in our protection contract. Now we can do all these really amazing integrations with other protocols, which I think will help us get us back in the conversation. Compared to where we were in 2019 and how much we were getting ignored back then, I think now Bancor is a little bit more in the conversation. And I see the V3 will be a big coming out moment for us. Remind folks who we are and why these designs are so impactful.
Welcome to Mission DeFi with Brad Nickel, where we explore projects in decentralized finance that are innovating and driving our mission of financial freedom forward. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review Mission DeFi and spread the word by posting a tweet to the show. All opinions expressed by Brad Nickel or his guests are their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Black Knox, Material Indicators, or any other affiliated organizations. You should not treat any opinion expressed by Brad Nickel or his guests as an inducement to make a particular investment, follow a particular strategy, or become involved with any project. A project being featured on the show is not an endorsement of that project in any way. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Now, here's Mission DeFi with Brad Nickel.
I'm excited today to have two members of the team of Bancor. And Bancor is the original AMM in DeFi, as most of you will know. I'm pretty excited to hear about what's coming next for them. So I'd like to welcome Mark Richardson and Nate Hindman to the show because they're going to talk to us about some of the history of Bancor and where it's headed next. But first, Nate, if you could introduce yourself, tell us about where you're from, what you're up to, and how you got into crypto and DeFi.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us on, Brad. I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts in the US. How did I get into DeFi? I stumbled down the rabbit hole probably in early 2017, started reading into Ethereum and getting very interested in it. Before that, started my career as a financial journalist and then was involved in several mobile development startups before stumbling upon crypto. Yep. So fast forward to 2017, I started reading a lot about Ethereum and met some folks from the Bancor project and joined in early 2018. Since then, I've worked on growth and marketing and some partnerships and strategy. And so that is my story.
I love the mixed backgrounds of so many people in this space. I think you're one of those examples of going from a financial journalist to into startups and tech, and then into this. Because I think everybody has to wear so many hats that it's great to have people that have done multiple things in their past.
Definitely. We see that. I think we have quite a bit of diversity on our team in terms of backgrounds too.
So, Mark, tell us about your rather interesting background and journey into crypto, if you could.
Yeah, certainly. So I don't come from a financial background at all. I was actually trained as a research scientist. So I completed a Bachelor of Science at Macquarie University in Sydney. I then did my PhD in organic chemistry at the University of Melbourne. My PhD was mostly sort of a biotech, immunology, synthetic chemistry project. Um, I was studying the way that tuberculosis interacts with the human immune system. After graduating with my doctorate, I received an invitation to start a postdoctoral appointment at the University of California, Irvine, studying under Greg Weiss. And there I was working on what are called single molecule sensors, which is a hugely challenging research project to be in. I went from studying sort of all the sticky stuff, the human immune system and bacteria and all that kind of thing, to dealing with a completely different set of challenges. I was learning how to build what are called single molecule transistors, or these were using graphite-like materials and single walled carbon nanotubes and things, expressed enzymes to build these tiny little microphones. And it was stressful, honestly. These things are extremely finicky. We're trying to construct new manufacturing processes essentially for commodity chemicals in biotechnology that were sold at huge premiums. And so one of the amino acids there that I was working with is called 4-azidophenylalanine. And this was sold at huge, huge markups to synthetic biology laboratories. And not much was known about it, honestly. It was being used for what's called non-canonical amino acid incorporation into proteins. So you could expand the genetic code of organisms from being forced to use 20 amino acids to using 21 amino acids, which is interesting. So you can end up with completely unnatural organisms. And yeah, this particular molecule was super interesting to that community, but no one really had a good way to synthesize it. I spent a bit of time working out how to make it on 100-gram to kilogram scales. And during that process, I actually discovered that it's got properties that make it akin to a high explosive, like a terrorism level sort of threat explosive. Yeah, and so I released a research paper that described how to manufacture it safely, and also for the first time characterized it as the explosive that it actually is. And that actually disrupted the world supply of that molecule for about 2 years. Because yeah, shipping laws changed in how this thing should be sold and stored. And I remember a friend of mine at Merck at the time picked up the phone and gave me a call and was like, "Is all of this true? Like, were you exaggerating?" I'm like, "No." I shared some of that data, and it changed the way that Merck handles their processes with that material forever. So yeah, it was a mixed bag. I was doing all this nanotechnology stuff, but also trying to stay true to my organic chemistry training, and we achieved a lot. I was invited to join the teaching side of things in my third year there. So the last 2 years at UCI, I was a lecturer for the first year, and I think second year organic chemistry classes, which went pretty well. But then eventually I guess I was feeling pretty homesick. I came back to Australia and joined the CSIRO, which is like the US National Labs. That organization invented Wi-Fi. It invented insect repellent. It invented stay-in contact lenses. It's a huge facility. I was trying to develop technology for like rapid diagnosis of drug-resistant infections in patients, especially for hospital-acquired infections and things like that. But then when the pandemic hit, I was suddenly pivoted over to developing the first strip antigen tests, like these kind of pregnancy test type things that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. So I was working on that, but I was getting bored. The pandemic was I was in Melbourne during all of this time, and I think we actually broke the world record for the longest consecutive lockdown. It came up on about 2 years. So Yeah. And so, yeah, into that early part of it, I was just I was going completely insane. I spent a lot of time educating myself on things that I never thought that I would be looking into, including cryptocurrency and DeFi. And I think I just became fascinated with that. I joined a bunch of DAOs just as a community member. I downloaded Telegram for the first time, which seems like this is one of the tells, I think, of a true cryptocurrency user now. And I became involved with the Bancor founders. We discussed some products. I helped design some new features. And then they offered me a full-time position is as working on research or product development. And I took it basically. I left my job as a scientist and started my job as, I don't know, DeFi architect. And that was about a year ago. So here we are. I'm a year into my DeFi career, and so far so good. But I still consider myself a scientist. I don't actually think that these two things that I do are as different from each other as people think they are.
No, I would totally agree with that. I think that it's at the core of everything we're building here. So absolutely agree. And certainly it brings a mindset and a skill set to this world that is probably a bit more rigorous about how things get done than some other folks in the space may be. So I think that makes complete sense for them to have been smart enough to say, hey man, come work for us. Have you felt like the environment was freer for you between this and kind of the science world?
Yeah, a little. Um, the Honestly, not necessarily the science world, but certainly the last place that I was working at. When I was in California, for example, and even during my PhD, I was given a lot of rope, really, and that's what blue sky research feels like. Your supervisor will have a grant for X amount of money. You'll have some clear goals, but also some margins that you're supposed to be exploring, some what we call side projects, right? Things that you are allowed to do just because they interest you, and if it doesn't work out, it's not a big deal, so long as you're completing the main stuff that you're working on.
Yeah.
And so a lot of universities work like that, and some of the best research comes out of the side projects rather than the main ones. And I think the best supervisors know that, and they know to let you do whatever is interesting, so long as you're not spending too much money. Whereas when you're working for a government agency, it's much, much more straight and narrow. There's not a lot of room to explore other stuff. The bureaucracy is a lot more rigid, and people are the way that the accounting works means that you have to justify every single cost with regards to some sort of main goal that's being met. So yeah, I would say that the university side of stuff, I was having a lot more fun. But yeah, the government agency stuff, the way that government labs are run is a lot less interesting.
It's
So yeah, I
yeah,
definitely have a
sorry.
lot more rope working in DeFi than I did for working for the government.
It's fascinating. I'm actually just reading this book called Loon Shots by Safi Bakal. And the whole premise of the first part of the book has to do with how the federal government during World War II moved all of the research out of the Defense Department in the United States and into those kinds of environments that you were just talking about for like you would have at a university, where there was this freedom to do the research and work, and talks about how many critical advancements came out of that microwave radar and those kinds of things that actually led to the West to the Allies winning that war. So that's very interesting, that juxtaposition, and has my point has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but I just find it fascinating. When I was going through the book, I was thinking about it in the context of DAOs and how they're functioning and how some of the rules that they came up with for managing that works.
Yeah. Everything in DeFi, I think, falls under that category.
Yeah.
I remember recently, I can't remember who said it, but there was one of the US senators' presentation to the Senate, I think, was to discuss the wild west of
Yeah.
crypto. So the former speaker kind of presented cryptocurrency as being something that is a dangerous and criminal enterprise, and that everything that should be done to quell it, right? While the opportunities here, like they made it seem like it was very urgent, it was a very alarmist kind of attitude. But then the next speaker introduced it as, well, Wild West is actually not such a bad term for it, because in America's history, it was people fleeing a conservative government that kind of established the West for what it was, and they ended up building a new society free of those issues. And so far, so good. Like, it actually went well.
Yeah.
Like, rough and tumble in the beginning, but its intentions were good. And that we should see cryptocurrency as trying to do something new, as fleeing an environment of overregulation, and that it's not necessarily something that needs to be stopped. Maybe it should be observed, or like maybe supervised, but not stopped. And I think I agree with that. What crypto is doing is finding somewhere where you can do stuff that in the traditional financial world would mean that you need an entire team of lawyers and advisors or something. You might need to lobby for a few years to get rules changed or whatever in order to try one thing. But in crypto, you could just try it. If you've got a good idea, just go out and do it. And I do think that this is how progress gets started. I do see it as a very positive change.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that actually, that narrative is very similar to what's in this book. I think it'd be great. I think everyone has an inkling of Bancor, but I think it's really important if you guys could lay the history down for us a little bit. This is like the original AMM that made this stuff happen, that actually us into this whole revolution. So can you guys walk us through some of the background of what happened, how it started, and what it was, and then we'll get into what it's becoming.
So Bancor actually started as a community currency company. It wasn't even connected to blockchain or crypto, just trying to build community currencies in different small communities. Let's say like a group of moms could trade their child's used clothing for babysitting time and have a currency to do. And very quickly, the need to connect those currencies to one another became obvious when, say, a mother has this type of local currency, but then wants to spend it on something outside of this group of moms. So very early on, we were thinking about how do we connect very illiquid currencies and new currencies to one another, and how do they know their exchange rates? And so then the core team that was working on this started looking deeply into blockchain and crypto in, let's say, 2015 and 2016, and ended up designing a system where you could build liquidity in a brand new currency using something that it called at the time a smart token, but now is called a liquidity pool or an automated market maker, where you can put two assets inside of a smart contract and connect it to another smart contract and make the assets within those contracts interchangeable for one another and know their exchange rates without needing an external source of data. And so this was the first kind of primitive that we came out with, the automated market maker on the blockchain. It was the first DeFi protocol. The ideas were being shared publicly in late 2016, early 2017. And then Bancor was launched in June 2017. The network went live.
So I'm assuming that at that point, once they saw the potential of this thing, this whole idea of these community tokens is still obviously there and viable, but it became much more focused on the technology they developed for the exchange.
So I think the sort of building out these community currencies really requires them to be accepted by, let's say, small businesses. And I
Sure.
think at the time and still today, getting that type of payments infrastructure and getting the businesses, onboarded is still something we really hope will happen. And we've had live community currency pilots using Bancor's technology in Kenya and in a lot of areas around the world. But we really wanted to focus on nailing the underlying technology instead of trying to fight this battle around payments. Now, I think that's starting to emerge. Now we're starting to see cryptocurrencies being adopted for the payments use case more and more. But we're very focused on creating the solutions for liquidity and then having probably another group really drive the adoption in like payments infrastructure and all that's needed to get it actually used for everyday payments. What we saw in 2017 when we launched was that there were a lot of brand new token projects that didn't necessarily want to pay the $200,000 plus listing fee on, say, Binance and Coinbase. And this was a permissioned process of getting listed on those exchanges. And they wanted to build this sort of instant liquidity in their tokens such that their community could perform these sort of on-chain swaps that AMMs have come to enable. And we discovered also very early on that this enables probably the most interesting use case of AMMs, which is that the holders of the asset, the token community, can deposit the tokens inside the pool and have their assets be used to facilitate trading by the AMM. And from each trade, generate a fee such that they can earn passive yield on their assets and also support the liquidity in that token. Now, something else that we discovered quite early on is that there is a risk to, let's call it, providing liquidity or depositing your tokens inside these AMM pools. And that's been called in the industry impermanent loss or divergence loss. And it occurs when the assets inside a pool diverge in price. The pool is selling off the asset or one of the assets for the other one and selling it effectively at a discount. Arbitrageurs are automated trading bots that effectively balance out prices inside of liquidity pools. And when the prices are diverging between assets, you can suffer as a staker or as a liquidity provider, you can suffer impermanent loss such that when you withdraw your liquidity from a pool, it is worth less than if you simply just held those two assets in your wallet on their own, never provided liquidity at all. So very early on, we realized that this is a pretty big blocker to fulfilling this sort of vision of AMMs as a technology that allows anyone to permissionlessly make markets. If the incentive isn't there, or if the risks are too high for people to provide liquidity, then they can't really scale to the point where we wanted them to. So fast forward a few years, you had seen several different projects clone the sort of Bancor model, the AMM. Every sort of swap that you've ever heard of, from Uniswap to SushiSwap to all these different AMM based DEXs across different exchanges, are iterations of Bancor's original model. Now, those products expose users to this risk of impermanent loss. They also require users who want to utilize them for yield to provide both assets to the pool. So the real innovation that got Bancor's name truly back on the map in late 2020 was our V2.1 version. And that effectively allowed users to provide liquidity in just a single asset, whereas you have to provide ETH and your token to most pools, or another asset in equal amounts to most pools. In Bancor, you can provide just a single asset and stay fully exposed to the price movements in that token, just like it was sitting in your wallet. And then secondly, the user is fully protected against impermanent loss. So they will withdraw at least the number of tokens that they put in, and plus the trading fees that they accrue, and also any liquidity mining rewards that are generated on the pool.
So on the version 2.1, can you give us a better idea of, just to set the framework for version 3, can you give us a better idea of really how that was possible, how this single-sided providing to liquidity pools worked, how you matched them up, and how that came about, what the functionality is that makes that possible?
Sure. So the way Bancor works is each pool has a common reserve asset in its reserves, and that is BNT, Bancor's network token. So whereas most pools are a token and ETH, or a token and a stable coin that they're paired together, all of Bancor's pools contain BNT in one side and then the token on the other side. And BNT is also an elastic supply token. So we have something called protocol owned liquidity. So effectively, what the protocol is doing when a user comes with, say, $100,000 worth of link, is the protocol will provide $100,000 worth of BNT and will take the other side of the liquidity pool. And just like the user provided tokens, Bancor will provide its BNT, and that BNT will generate fees from trading fees that go through the pool. And so Bancor can then use those trading fees to compensate the user for any impermanent loss that they might have suffered on the tokens that they provided, and any excess that, after they've covered any impermanent loss. And again, when a user withdraws from the pool, that's when the protocol would compensate them for any impermanent loss they suffer. And any amount greater than that is then burned for BNT once the withdrawal happens.
And the BMT that's put up by the protocol, is that protocol inventory or is that minted for that purpose?
That's minted for that purpose
Okay.
and generally stays within the pool. It's not liquidity mining rewards that are in the hands of users. It stays within the protocol generally.
Got it. Okay. So you guys solved the impermanent loss problem and you provided a way for people that had a particular token that they wanted to hold to actually earn more from it and not suffer that risk. What then was left that you guys really felt like you needed to improve upon that further? Or what did you decide? How did you decide to improve upon it further?
I think the if you ask any of our users, they'd be able to tell you exactly what sort of the pain points are in the version 2.1 system. One of the big ones, and I think one of the reasons why the TVL of the project is not nearly as high as it could be, is that we've deliberately limited how much liquidity can actually be provided on Bancor version 2.1.
Ah.
Yeah, and we've really, that's a necessity, because if we said on version 2.1 that if you supply any amount of liquidity, the Bancor protocol will support all of it, then you open yourself up to basically an insurance problem that you can't effectively manage. If someone is providing, let's just say someone wanted to provide $100 billion in something tomorrow, right? Should the protocol actually insure that? It might not make financial sense. If you ask an actuary to evaluate that, they'll just pull their hair out. It just doesn't make sense for a protocol to be wearing that kind of risk so quickly.
Sure.
It's possible that you could eventually approach that level of TVL and insure it without any issues. You can't do that in your maiden year. And so the pools were all capped. And this is something that the Bancor DAO has done, I would say, extremely well. And it's one of the most important purposes of the DAO. That's deciding how big each pool should be. And so obviously for the most trusted cryptocurrencies, things like Ethereum itself, wrapped Bitcoin is also very popular, and Chainlink, these pools can be allowed to get pretty deep, right? They're very well established. Their distributions are pretty good. It's unlikely that they're going to go 1,000 to 10,000x or something ridiculous anytime in the next, or it's unlikely that they're going to go 1,000 to 10,000x very quickly, at least. And so from the standpoint of wanting to ensure this kind of price divergence, we don't have too much to worry about. And so those pools are allowed to get very deep. But what about new cryptocurrencies? What about things like Shiba Inu or Loki or some of these other meme coins, or even new layer ones? I think even Avalanche last year, its native token managed to clear 100x pretty quickly. I think Phantom did the same thing. There are new cryptocurrencies that, even though we trust them, even though we think that they serve a bona fide purpose, that their price action can be very difficult to ensure against divergence loss in an AMM context. And so we can still have them, but we need to make sure that the size of the pool scales with the relative risk. So if the risk is high, then we need to make sure that the pool is relatively small. And as the cryptocurrency matures, then we can easily grow to a larger and larger pool. And if you've been paying attention to how pools have grown over the last year, then that's certainly the case. But it's still a point of friction, right? That if someone's showing up with all of this money that they want to add to your DEX, and we have to turn them away, or that they can only provide a certain amount, it's in a competitive landscape where TVL is one of the KPIs that investors and other people are paying attention to. It hasn't been, let's say, strictly strategic to tell people, no, we don't want your money. So that's a huge pain point. Another pain point is that once you've deposited on Bancor, you can on Bancor version 2.1, you can withdraw whenever you want, but your insurance policy is vested over a 100-day period, which means that if you do suffer any impermanent loss, if you expect to withdraw without having to eat that impermanent loss yourself, or at least part of it, your insurance policy, you want to wait for that to vest, and that's going to take 100 days. 100 days is a long time in cryptocurrency. And so I would say that's another significant pain point. The other issue is the non-composability of our system. right? In order to track impermanent loss, we were using our best understanding at the time of the best way to do that. And that required us to track each user's position individually. And if you think about it, this makes sense because if IL is a result of the divergence in the price of two different assets, then it matters when a user contributes their liquidity, right? It's not the pool overall that has IL, but it's each specific user's position within that pool that has IL. And all of those users might disagree, right, on how bad the IL has been for them. So you can't generalize it, right? It's a very user specific phenomenon. And that means that version 2.1 had non-fungible user positions associated with each one of those IL contracts. And that made it very gas intensive, right? So the non-fungibility, non-composability, and gas intensive nature of version 2.1, the 100-day vesting period, and the capped pools, I would say are all things that were, let's say, less than ideal, or certainly were targets for improvement.
Yeah, I could definitely see how those would be a hindrance. Now, I would assume though that the improvement at least brought more interest into Bancor at that point. So have you guys seen some decent levels of growth at this point up
Well,
until
so yeah, obviously, the Bancor version 2.1, like despite these things, it's still been an immensely popular protocol. I would say that we're attracting a slightly different demographic to what I would say DeFi usually targets. What we're not seeing is the teenagers of DeFi. I don't mean that
I know what
I
you
don't
mean
mean to sound.
exactly. That's good.
Yeah, thank you, yeah.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of people from the ICO era of cryptocurrency in our community. The people that have really been here for a long time, they understand the industry a lot better than some of the newcomers do. They know what it feels like to be scammed. They know what it feels like to suffer impermanent loss and have no one explain it to you. And so they could gravitate towards Bancor, I think, because it's this like the adults table in a way. And the kinds of conversations that you have in our Telegram channels are very different to those that you might have in, say, like a sushi swap channel or something like that. But having said that, these projects do tend to grow up pretty quickly. And while the contrast was stark, right, a year ago, I would say that it's starting to fade a little bit now as those other communities are growing up with us. But yeah,
Yeah.
we did attract a very certain demographic, and it has been hugely positive. But we have known about what these issues are, and that's why Bancor version 3 was designed the way it was.
Yeah, and I think that I think we'll go through the same cycle this time that we went through last time. When we're having a downturn, people start getting more serious about the fundamentals. They really start looking at being more practical than 1,500% APY, whatever it
I
may
like to
be.
Yeah, I like to say that when people are happy, they get stupid. And it's when people get angry that they get smart.
Yeah.
And I think we've been through sort of part of that euphoric phase. And I don't want to point the finger at any project in particular because no one is more guilty than the rest.
Yeah.
Generally, when you have these, I want to call it an unsubstantiated growth in, the valuation of something, right? Where you can't really find any reason for that value to have accrued in the way that it did. Maybe other than narrative or something else. That kind for me marks those euphoric phases.
Yeah.
And it's when people start to talk about the consequences of how that project has been run, or they start to talk about the consequences of mining rewards and other stuff, and that's when you know that the conversation is starting to sober up. And if you start getting a lot of abuse on Twitter or Telegram or something, like that's generally a sign that the market is wising up. And I generally think that it's a good thing, right? It's when people start getting angry, that's when you get to start having the conversations that drive everything forward. When people are just having a party, it's really hard to make progress.
Absolutely. And look, I think something that's very interesting that might come out of this, as you were speaking and talking about, things that have value that they don't deserve or shouldn't have, all one has to do is take a quick look at the stock market and see how that still permeates traditional finance. What would be interesting is if the Wild West actually became better at having better valuation models than because of the crowd than traditional finance, something more centrally controlled. So I find that dynamic interesting. I think that's really cool. Um, I want to get into three in a minute, but I wanted to ask a quick question. When someone is trading on Bancor, right? If the pairs that you all set up are in the liquidity pools, paired with BNT, are you guys just doing multiple trips if someone's trading, say, Link against USDC or Link against Ethereum? Is that something you're just tripping through the liquidity pools, or are you just summing it up at the end? How does that work for the traders that don't have to trade necessarily against BNT?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So if you want to trade ETH for Link, for example, you get the correct price evaluation for that two-leg cycle, because you're effectively first trading your ETH for BNT and then your BNT for Link.
Got it.
And that's helpful, right? That's one of the things about Bancor that I always thought was the most beautiful, is that it solves the problem, like the pricing problem, by introducing its own numeraire. That's really what BNT is, the universal numeraire for the protocol. And because everything is priced versus it's the thing that you can cancel out when you want to know the price of anything versus anything else. Like, that's actually quite pretty. And the reason I liked it, before I even knew that this was the Bancor had developed this approach before any of the other AMMs were even thinking about how to launch or something, like before they got their inspiration from Bancor. The fact that the token that is used as the universal numeraire is the project's own token is important, because if you're using something else, it feels like you're using someone else's project's token, for that same purpose. And this means that you're going to be quite stifled with regards to things like monetary policy. And I think that this is what is lacking from the approach that Uniswap took, because Uniswap, even though it was funded and founded, I would say, by the Ethereum Foundation, it's still its own thing. The Uniswap community can't decide what the properties of Ethereum should be in order to make their protocol something else. And even then, like, ETH is, I would say, demonstrably a bad choice, because one of the first things that they had to do in order to incorporate it into the pools was learn how to wrap it. Just by itself, it's not even computationally compatible with how AMMs are run. So yeah, the fact that BNT is in all the pools, it does give us that ability to evaluate the price of everything versus everything else. But it also means that the token can be made to do whatever it needs to do to scale the protocol. But we don't have to rely on another project like the Ethereum project we don't have to petition them to do stuff for us. It's helpful to control the thing that is in all of the pools, rather than rely on someone else to do that for you.
That makes complete sense. Have you guys, from a data perspective, noticed, I assume this is true, but is there an overall kind of impact on the price of BNT relative to the volume being traded or the amount of activity happening within the exchange itself?
Yeah, so it's a pretty good question. So I think at any one time, about 80% of all BNT in existence is usually inside the protocol, is inside the liquidity pools.
Nice.
So we still have a pretty healthy amount that's not inside the protocol. So yeah, BNT is supremely liquid, right? I would say it's one of the most liquid ERC20s in existence. You can go to Binance, you can buy it on Coinbase, you can go KuCoin. All of the major centralized exchanges have market makers that are using the token, but they're making markets from that less than 20% wedge that's not inside the protocol. And then the protocol, all of the BNT inside it, is already being used to make markets. So it is very liquid. And so you can have a lot of confidence in the BNT price. Now that has its own behavior. One of I would say the key characteristics of cryptocurrency is its ridiculous volatility. Like, it's stuff that would make the Wall Street guys jump out of buildings. We see 70% drawdown sometimes in an hour. It's unheard of in the traditional financial markets.
Sure.
And this is partially a function of the illiquidity of some of these assets. So I think a lot of the people trading these things, they often don't think about how market cap and illiquidity it means that you shouldn't trust necessarily the capitalization you're being reported with. One of the examples that I give here is, if we wanted to start Bradcoin, right? We can decide on certain things, like maybe there should be 1 trillion Bradcoins, and that's fine. So you and I will start our own little project. We'll print 1 million Bradcoins, but now there's no price. So how about, after we print them, you buy one of them from me for $1, right? And so now we've got our first trade. one Brad coin sold for $1.
Right.
Because we printed 1 trillion of them, is our market cap now $1 trillion? It's worth asking.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. It's worth asking because a lot of people, that's exactly what people do. And it often doesn't really make much sense. Some people do bring in things like fully diluted market capitalization, but even then it's a bit of an illusion. And that volatility that you get is partially a result of how little it takes to move the price of something. BNT doesn't have that because it's constantly in price discovery with almost its entire supply. And so that means that when it's quoting its price to you, you can actually have a lot of confidence in that price, and you can sell and buy vast quantities of BNT at that price without moving it very much. So it's not necessarily that the price of BNT becomes a function of whatever we have in the pools, but it does mean that its volatility is greatly tempered as a result. So generally it takes a lot more buying pressure, a lot more selling pressure to move the price of BNT. But it's also worth mentioning that it's always relative to something. Like when we're talking about moving the price of BNT, what do we mean? Because it doesn't necessarily mean versus the US dollar. It means versus the aggregate price of the entire network. So in a way, we've got this reserve currency in a way that all of the liquidity that's been contributed in TKN, right, on the non-BNT side of the pool, its volatility is still driving swaps on the pool, and it still changes the valuation of BNT a little bit. And as the markets equilibrate, it's true that the BNT price does hug the grand average of the weights of each pool multiplied by their prices in US dollars, if that's how you want to measure it. So as the price of ETH rises or falls, it does have an effect on the BNT price, and as the price of Bitcoin rises and falls, it does have an effect. But it's not a deterministic feature. It's more like just one of the influences. So if people decided to stop trading BNT altogether, like no more buying and no more selling, the price of BNT would continue to move as this kind of with the grand average of the network. And then there are periods of speculation where users will buy or sell quite a large amount of it, and that will cause the price of BNT to move away from that average. But yeah, it's an interesting effect. It does give BNT a quasi stable profile, but not relative to the US dollar. It gives it a stable profile relative to cryptocurrency markets on average. So yeah, it's these two things, right? The volatility and the price index effect of BNT that make it an interesting token to hold.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I think that's actually an interesting metric, that price relative to the entire crypto market is a very interesting thing. That would be interesting to track. That's fascinating.
It reminds me of things like Rye, like where there are these kinds of, it's a feature, it's not a bug. Volatility is nice on an emotional level, because if you see something go 100x, you think that you're 100x richer, but you might find that as soon as you sell the thing, that you weren't actually 100x richer. Someone just bought something at a ridiculous price, and maybe as you sell it, the price comes down again. So you don't end up with sort of an accurate idea of how much or at least the reported price doesn't actually give you a good idea of how much more wealth you really have. But things like Rye are designed to get around this issue, where so for those who don't know what it is a new type of stablecoin, but it isn't pegged to any price. It's more like it's pegged to a certain volatility. I need to look into it in more detail. Don't take anything that I say here as gospel. But we are seeing that these kinds of concepts are starting to rise out of the woodwork now, which is interesting, because I personally have been talking about having something that's relatively non-volatile but still has price discovery as being like a virtue. It's something that we should be excited for, because it means that all it means is the quality of the price that you have is that much better. The certainty that you have in the market cap of the project is that much better. And yeah, I do see it as a feature, not a bug. Although I do concede that roller coaster, that sometimes people are in cryptocurrency for the ride. Like that's a part of it. So you do lose out on that gambler's that thrill of seeing numbers go up and down. Yeah, that rush. But as a way to store value, it's actually quite attractive.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm sorry, Nate, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, a lot of people call our LP product sort of a set and forget thing. It's not for folks who are in front of a computer all day, trading in and out of stuff, moving stakes in and out of different liquidity pools. And I guess you could think of BNT as a sort of set and forget token. It has this sort of index like feature where it tracks the prices of the biggest pools on the network or is influenced by those prices. And at the same time, it's a token that you hold to get yield on. Anyone who's holding BNT, I always tell them you should be staking it because there's 40, 50% yields that you're going to get. And these are long-term yields. We've seen for over a year now, being able to get 30, 40+% yield by providing your BNT to an individual pool. And then going into V3, which I know we haven't dug into yet, it's going to get even easier. You're not even going to have to choose a pool, and still you're going to enjoy some pretty attractive yields when you stake your BNT.
That's interesting. And I think there's a lot of folks that are wishing right about now they'd gone with the more conservative BNT approach instead of jumping in out of yield farms for the last 6
Yeah.
months.
Yeah, and what's interesting as well, if any regulators are listening, this isn't financial advice. I generally don't talk about price or anything, but my interviewer did raise the question of price, and so I'm going to answer it as completely as I can. And so with that aside, it is worth pointing out that despite these properties, which I would say that some users get frustrated with it because they do miss the roller coaster, that even with these properties and this kind of, let's say, tempering of volatility, BNT is still the second best performing DeFi token over 2021. I think that in terms of measured from the bottom of the cycle, we're still at something like 30x up, and it peaked at 100x up. I think the only token to have outperformed us on Ethereum is YFI. There's on other chains, there's some stuff on Avalanche and Solana and stuff that has outperformed us, but I don't have a huge amount of data on that. But within our locale, even with this kind of volatility tempering, it's not price negative. It's not even price neutral. It has been performant. So I really do see it as a non-issue, but there are going to be weeks and months where users are asking, what's happening to the price? Can the devs do something? And it is what it is. I can't make the markets do anything other than what they're going to do. But yeah, in general, it hasn't been a pain point. It's been, I see it generally as a strength of the project, not a weakness.
Yeah, so you've got that stability of price and you have the gains that have been made while you're also staking it and earning decent yields it would still make the traditional banker blush relative to what can be done here. What, just real quickly, and then let's jump into version 3. When I'm staking my BNT, is that part of the BNT overall pool? So it's not just coming from the project's minting of tokens. It's actually the BNT that I staked is also utilized for trades.
One of the ways that you can think about it, or at least how I think about it that I find helpful, is that the protocol's BNT can be treated as something like a placeholder, right? So the protocol will always prefer to accept users' BNT rather than minted.
Got it.
And so it becomes a question of, okay, how do we achieve that? Because at the time when the TKN user is going to provide their tokens, there needs to be BNT there, right? You can't wait for a user that's holding BNT to come and deposit alongside them. You need to deposit the right amount right at that moment in time on that exact transaction. So that's how it works. You need the protocol to mint BNT at that moment in time, and then it deposits its BNT alongside the TKN user. And then later on, if a BNT user wants to join that pool, their BNT replaces the protocol's BNT. And you can think of it either as the BNT user burns their own BNT tokens in order to take a share of what the protocol has, or that the protocol withdraws its BNT and burns it so that the user's BNT can come in. These are actually redundant processes. The point is that whenever a BNT user deposits BNT to the protocol, that it results in a BNT burning event and a transfer of ownership from the protocol to the user.
That makes sense. I just wanted to clarify that from earlier in the conversation to make sure that I understood that users are first in on providing, and then if the protocol needs to, it meant is basically the idea.
Correct. Yeah.
Cool. So we had four issues that you all still wanted to address from version 2.1. Let's climb into kind of what version 3 does for Bancor and DeFi in general, and march through those if you could.
So remember a lot of those pain points that I was discussing earlier in our conversation, things like the fact that the pools are capped, the gas consumption, all of those things basically became the list of everything that V3 needed to be, right? We needed to resolve all of these issues. So let's start at the top. In version 2.1, the pools were capped. In version 3, that's no longer true. We've completely overhauled the architecture. We're no longer using it's no longer just an aesthetic change, right? On version 2.1, the insurance contracts and single-sided deposits and all of that kind of stuff, it's really just like another set of contracts on top of the old Bancor technology. So we get the desired result, but the fundamental layer hasn't changed. On version 3, that's no longer true. And that means that we can do things in a way that means that we're not taking on any additional risks. So for example, we were inspired by Balance's version 2, which kind of demonstrated to the industry that you can use a vault model where all of the tokens across the protocol can be stored in a single location. And the way that the pools operate is just as a logic layer that plugs into the vault. So essentially all of the pools don't contain any tokens anymore. They just tell the vault how much money it's receiving and how much money it should release. There's huge gas savings to doing it this way, because it also means that you can do that two swap that you were discussing before. With fewer token transfers, because you don't actually need to transfer BNT in the intermediate hop, which is a huge advantage to traders with regards to the gas cost of using the protocol. Yeah. It also means that we can do other interesting things, because now that the pools are synthetic, right? They just report what the balances are. You can make the pools represent anything you want, right? You can virtualize them in any way. So this means that we can have, for example, a pool with $50 million that's tradable while having $100 million of liquidity inside the vault. And you might think maybe that's weird, but actually so far with all of the research we've done over the last year, it looks like concentrating liquidity is a bad idea. It might be a better idea to go the other way, right? Let the protocol hodl some of its own tokens rather than making markets with everything. I mean, this is a really significant way that you can diminish the risk without necessarily having to sacrifice on things like slippage, right? So like it's not unusual to see something like $250 million in liquidity on some protocols, but where the trading volume is usually some very small fraction of that. And as long as traders are willing to stomach like a 0.1% slippage on most of their trades, or even the highest of their trades, then maybe you should let the pool's liquidity adjust to what the market is actually using, rather than having it constantly all fall for sale. What that translates to from a user-facing perspective is that on Bancor version 3, you can contribute any amount of TKN liquidity, and the pool will accept all of it, or at least the vault will accept all of it. You'll be issued single-sided pool tokens, which is a new fungible and composable element of the system that should be able to be used in other sort of DeFi Lego situations. So for example, you can stake them on Aave if you want to. If someone creates a liquidity pool for them somewhere else, you can do that. You can send them to your friends and whatever. They're fungible, composable, standard ERC20s. But they're also interestingly secure for a pool token. In just towards the end of last year, do you remember the Cream finance hack? Did you? Yeah. So this was caused by a vulnerability in the way that most pool tokens derive their value. And what happened was that a sophisticated individual managed to annex the majority of the pool token supply for something, and then they effectively just donated a huge amount of money to the vault, which drove the price of these pool tokens up. And so I say donated because it wasn't an actual deposit. They found a way to cause the value of the pool token to increase without increasing the number of pool tokens that there are. And this allowed them to exploit Cream Finance for a ridiculous amount of money. And so this is something that we were already aware of prior to Cream Finance being exploited, where this kind of price manipulation game is not new. And we wanted to make sure that if we were developing a new fungible and composable system, that these kinds of security problems, not for our protocol, but for everyone else's protocols, wouldn't be there. So the way that our pool tokens are created are actually immune from this kind of price manipulation attack, which should make them highly desirable in other DeFi projects as collateral or something else, which is nice. The other thing that's nice about these pool tokens is that they only represent the token that you provided. So if you provide Chainlink, you're going to get a Chainlink pool token that essentially is like an up only token. I think this is the term that the community has decided to adopt. But essentially, it only represents an equivalent amount of link that is withdrawable from the system with that pool token. And as fees and everything else accumulates, that only goes up over time because it is devoid of impermanent loss. It can only go up or sideways, which is helpful and in a way more desirable than Chainlink itself as collateral against a loan or something like that. So these are all very helpful outcomes to the way that we've designed the new system.
Real quickly let me make sure I understand the up only concepts. Obviously, if the price of Link, if you deposited Link and the price of Link dropped, you would lose that value, but you wouldn't lose like you would in a permanent loss situation because you're not two-sided, and you
Right.
still are gaining the fees that you gained for providing liquidity.
Yeah.
Got it.
So the pool token is redeemable for a certain number of Link tokens, and that number of Link tokens is going up over time. It's never going down. But you're right. The actual value of it can change with the Chainlink price,
Got it.
but that you're still better off from a collateralization perspective, having something that is slowly accumulating more Chainlink over time rather than having a static amount of Chainlink that's susceptible to the same price movements.
That's fascinating. I
Yeah.
definitely think some people are going to utilize that in other protocols because it makes complete sense to be able to offer. That's really cool.
Right. The other thing that we've improved is, remember we spoke about that 100-day vesting period.
Right.
So we've managed to eliminate that. Using Monte Carlo simulations, our chief economist was basically investigating this apparent exploit vector, right? It exists in the math, but there might not be an actual financial instrument available that can make use of it. But we know that it's there. And that's where this vesting period comes from. And so what we do is we try to measure, we basically consider the insurance protection as being a free American perpetual option. And we price that. And so what we have to look at is how does the price of the option diminish over time? And as long as you've found a point where the price of the option is so small that as long as it's small relative to gas costs, basically, or the convenience of using the blockchain, then you're generally pretty safe. And it looks like something like 3 or 4 days is all that's really required before the price of the option is flat permanently.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, again, combining real data that we have over version 2.1, volatility data, that is, with kind of our best guesses of worst case scenarios. And so this is the drop from 100 days down to something like 3 or 4 days is partially a reflection of the cryptocurrency markets are actually calming down. So the volatility data that we had prior to 2020 really suggested that 100 days is going to be necessary. Whereas after 2021, we're down by, a factor of 20,
Wow.
which is interesting.
Very interesting.
So yeah, looking at that, but that means that, okay, because the system is fungible and composable, you still don't really know how, if a user has a pool token, when they provided it. The system doesn't record user addresses anymore. There are no user positions, which, means that we've got a lot less gas consumption, but it also means that from the protocol's perspective, there's only one user. Everyone that holds these pool tokens are equivalent. So rather than having a vesting period at the beginning, you have a vesting period at the end. When you want to withdraw from the protocol, there's a 7-day cooldown period, and we're hoping to shave a couple of days off of that over time. But yeah, there's a lockup where you commit to the number of tokens that you would like to withdraw, and then that begins a 7-day cooldown. And then at the end of that 7 days, you can withdraw the full position, ignoring impermanent loss, which is pretty good, and so much better than waiting 100 days, in my opinion. But it's not bad. I also concede that it's somewhat of a compromise, because at least with the old system, if you were there for 100 days, you could withdraw at any moment at the push of a button. And so we've had to compromise on that a little bit, but I still think overall it's a massive improvement. But yeah, I'm not, it's a minor inconvenience, I see, but the security benefits that you get from something like this is just astronomical. And yeah, it's unfortunate that we always need to assume that someone's going to try and exploit the protocol. It is what it is.
Yep.
But yeah, we're always on the, I like to say luck favors the paranoid.
Yeah.
And so far that's proven true. I think it's too easy to get complacent. And I think people massively underestimate the intelligence of their adversaries in this space.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And obviously, it's an ongoing game. Quick question on the 7-day cooldown period. So if I decide that I'm going to start that process, that countdown, is that an irreversible process, or is that something I can change my mind on in the middle
Yeah,
of the 7 day?
you can change your mind. That's not a problem at all. And in fact, because when you begin this process, you've already agreed to a withdrawal value. And so let's say over that 7 days, it's been a really good week for that token or something. There might have been some fees and things on there that you might have been like, I didn't really want to miss out on that week. And so at the end of that 7 days, you can decide to cancel the withdrawal, and then your pool tokens will immediately go up in value again.
Nice.
As
So
if,
you
as if,
keep that value gained during that time. So even though it was locked out.
Yeah.
great.
And so we've spoken to a lot of market research goes into these kinds of decisions. And for a lot of people, they like that idea of what if that kind of forcing you to reconsider and then getting this rewind button. What would happen if I didn't withdraw? It's for a lot of people, I guess they can secure about their own impulsiveness. And something like this is actually helpful. And then there's another camp of people that are like, but what if the token price goes down that week or something? And there's no single satisfactory answer that's going to make it better for everyone.
Yeah.
But I still think that it's not all, I'm just saying it's not all bad news. I think that it's super positive. Like on balance, it's much, much better than anything that we've had previously. I also think, including IL protection and everything else, better than anything else in the industry. But I submit that it's imperfect and we can improve it over time. I still think it's pretty damn good though.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. Let me ask you a question though. Have you guys thought about how you present a 7-day cooldown period to people that never experienced the 100-day period?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this is going to be something for the front end team to handle and present it in the friendliest possible way. But the way that I explained it recently is when I was a teenager, it was common that it would take that long for a check to clear. And so it's similar to that. So I think that in 2021 was used to the instantaneity of things like Venmo and PayPal and that kind of thing. But these are recent innovations. If we're explaining a cooldown period to someone who's new to cryptocurrency, there are several sort of real world facing versions of it that I could easily point to. So for example, a lot of Forex transactions can take more than a week to clear. I know no one's using checks anymore, but they can still take 3 days to a week. A lot of like when you're liquidating a loan with your bank or something, I know this can take up to 14 days in Australia, for example. Yeah, like there are, I would say that it's not too alien a concept, but maybe for people who have only ever done internet banking or something before, then sure, that it's gonna require a little bit of education. But if they're using internet banking, they're also used to 0% interest. So I think that the product will still speak for itself. I don't see it as being too much of an issue.
But look, I think that the way that the lock works, that during that 7-day period, you could actually have a gain that causes you to change your mind. I think that's interesting. And look, I think for standard DeFi users who've been in yield farming and liquidity pools and expect to pull in and out right away, it's not that they'll have to adapt conceptually to the fact that this is a more stable thing. But at the same time, there are other protocols out there that have locks where
Exactly.
what is it, 16 weeks and Curve, and so I don't think it's completely I don't think it's something that's completely foreign to standard DeFi users. But I was just actually curious from a UX perspective how you guys were planning on.
And
The other thing is that it's also going to do a lot with regards to filtering out the kinds of customers that we don't want. There are a lot of users in DeFi that I don't want to call them destructive, because honestly, they're DeFi's most avid fan base. But the frequency with which they do things can be a very destabilizing force on a protocol like ours. And so really, I'm glad that they're there. I think that they do a tremendous amount of good. The mercenaries of DeFi, they don't get enough credit, honestly. They've really, they've helped to make DeFi what it is. But I would rather that they're doing it somewhere else.
The mercenaries don't get enough credit, but I'd really rather they do it somewhere else.
And so I don't think that we should necessarily be making a product specifically for them. It's the regular user looking more towards the horizon with regards to what DeFi should be. The normal users, normal everyday use cases, that kind of thing. And if a 7-day cooldown period is obscene for you, that's fine. You don't have to use Bancor. I don't mind where you go. But it's the people that don't think it's obscene that I think are going to be providing a lot more value anyway. That's where our values are, and I think that it's a good choice for us in the long run.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. In terms of, first of all, are there other components of version 3 we should go through here?
I can just, since we've just gone over so much there, I can just rattle off the features
Great.
and maybe Brad, if you want to dig into any, or if we didn't
Yeah,
cover any,
that'd be
we can just
cool.
dive in there. Mark has covered that we'll have instant and permanent loss protection with that 7-day lockup. So instead of 100 days, you're protected from day one. Whereas before there were deposit limits on our pools, now there are no limits whatsoever. So you can come with however amount of liquidity that you want. There will be something called an omni pool, where instead of deciding where to stake your BNT, you stake it just in one pool, and that aggregates revenue from the entire network. And also, notably, this removes this sort of double hop issue that we talked about before. So it allows us to virtualize this hop between BNT such that we can now mimic, say, the gas costs of a single hop trade. And this will increase the capital efficiency of the liquidity that you stake. Now, just like that single hop that you would get on, say, a Uniswap or a sushi swap between, let's say, ETH and Link, now you get a single hop on Bancor too.
Right.
Rewards today, up until today, had just been BNT rewards. Now we will allow third-party protocols to drop rewards on their pools. And also, up until today, rewards have required a manual restaking process, gets deposited in a rewards contract, and the user has to restake those rewards on their own. Now rewards will be auto-compounded within the pool. So you won't have to stake them on your own, and you'll automatically compound those rewards. The last thing is that V3 is actually being deployed in 3 phases. So everything I just mentioned is being deployed in phase 1. We're calling Bancor 3 sort of a new dawn for DeFi, or a new day for DeFi. So phase 1 will be called dawn. Phase 2 will be called sunrise. Phase 3 will be called daylight. The juiciest stuff, I think, is in phase 2. We haven't gone public with what that is going to be, but we have hinted at what some of the sort of core innovations will be. And that's something that we've been talking about, called superfluid liquidity. And it's that the protocol can not only generate fees from trading now, but can generate fees from something called strategies. So your liquidity can be used for both trading and also for strategies that can be both external to the protocol and also native to the protocol. So an example of an external strategy might be for a link holder. We've been told that link staking is going to go live, explicit staking in nodes sometime in 2022. And we've been hearing from a lot of our users. We have by far the biggest link pool. I think it's upwards of 400 million liquidity now. And they're trying to say that they've been thinking, I have to decide between staking my link in an explicit staking to support Chainlink, or providing my link to Bancor to get yield. And at some stage in V3, as a link holder, you won't have to decide. You can just provide your liquidity to Bancor's pool, and Bancor can potentially use that liquidity to stake within a link, within a node on your behalf. So you're then generating fees from trading and fees from explicit staking. And that's an example of the sort of external strategies that would be available to LPs.
That's awesome. So that's like the Lido model for ETH 2.0, but you potentially could be doing this across multiple protocols.
And it's going to be like each token presents its own interesting challenges. I'm discussing the link stuff with a lot of link node operators now. But then after we figured that out, we want to do the same thing for like graph, like staking graph on subgraph is an interesting use case. And like you said, like leader, staking ETH on things like Beacon Chain for consensus, that kind of thing. All of these things can be easily implemented as modules on top of Bancor version 3. And we see this as being a big component of kind of the future proofing of the DEX.
I just interviewed Josh Neurath from Anchor, and they're going to be deploying a node model to replace Infura in a decentralized way. And that's also something they're doing, is providing rewards if you've got the node or whatever. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities like that. And Anchor is also one that shares a similar, more conservative philosophy about DeFi. That's interesting. That sounds pretty powerful. Are there other components at phase 2 you can hint to here?
Let's see, Mark, what other alpha can we potentially drop about phase 2?
That's there's so much I wanted to talk about, but it's up to you, right? You're the gatekeeper.
I think that's the most we can say for now, just that you'll be able to earn even more doing even less with your liquidity. And that Bancor, is really not solely focused on trading to generate fees, but also all these other different types of activities that you can use in DeFi or do in DeFi, you'll also be able to do in Bancor, and the protocol will do much of that just on your behalf.
I think, or maybe on this note, and it would hardly qualify as alpha, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment anyway. There's a law in economics called Herteling's law, and it's a formal proof that competitors always have an incentive to be as close to each other as possible. And this is both conceptually and sometimes in terms of geographical location, it means literally. So, for example, the Burger King menu is a nearly carbon copy of the McDonald's menu by design. One of the most common ways that this is explained is using the location of gas stations inside major cities. So if there's a city that's got a single gas station in it, you might think that, oh, okay, there's certainly room for competition there. Where should I put my gas station? You might draw a ring around the city and think, okay, I should put my gas station somewhere where I get like an obvious share of one side of the city. Like I'm closest to these customers, the other gas station is closest to the other customers, and then there's like a division between us where we're competing for the customers in the middle. But then you realize I can increase my share by moving my gas station slightly closer to theirs. Now the distance between us is smaller, so I've got a much larger share of my side of the city, and the amount of customers that we're competing with in the middle has shrunk. And then you take this to its logical conclusion and you realize that you should build your gas station immediately next to your competitor. And this is provable that this is actually the most strategic way to build competing gas stations inside any locality. And DeFi is the same. In terms of the kinds of stuff that's on offer, I think that over time, we will start to see DeFi protocols looking closer and closer to each other in terms of the features and offerings and stuff that they give their users. We're still a long way from it. There's a clear distinction between something like SushiSwap and Uniswap and Aave and Compound and all these things, but maybe not between Compound and Aave necessarily. I think over time, eventually, all DeFi protocols will look exactly the same, and it will really just be their identity and branding that makes them unique. And I'm always thinking about that, because you really don't want to be the last person to realize that's the way that things are drifting.
That's very interesting. I think that's interesting from the perspective of what you all might be planning to launch, but I also think it's very interesting from the perspective of composability, right? One of the things that I often advocate for is that we actually don't, this is extreme, but that eventually we shouldn't necessarily need interfaces to the protocols that we use that exist on the protocol's website per se. I feel like the UI and UX should be extracted away into the wallet or whatever that becomes. And those interface components are sent from the protocol to the interface to be pulled up, but they aren't necessary. And I think that the whole Legos of this space means that the real winners are going to be the ones that actually make the composability happen and work with as many things as possible. And I also think they'll be the winners that get us into the real world sooner than later, will be the ones that adapt that even better. So I find that really interesting. And how far are you guys going in these phases with actual composability? Like how much of the platform will be available for other protocols to utilize?
We've made the decision early on that you should never underestimate the power of composability at this stage. And so we want to make sure that everything that we do is as composable as possible. I said earlier on that we wanted to make sure that the DeFi tokens, sorry, the pool tokens that we're using aren't just composable but secure, because we don't want anyone else to be wrecked because we made an insecure system, right? It's not enough that Bancor protects itself. We also need to make sure that the things that we're developing protect other protocols if the intention is that our pool tokens are going to find use cases elsewhere. And so that's fine. I do think that composability is likely to get better over time. I think in decades from now, composability is going to be used for whole protocol arbitrage. And I mean that in a very indistinct way right now, because I'm not even sure what it means. But essentially that the performance of one protocol can be arbitraged against the performance of another. And that's going to be interesting. Something similar to like LIBOR, where, you know, like I said, I don't even know what it's going to look like, but I do think that it will be something like it'll be a commoditized thing that people can use as like an index, and that those indexes can be traded against each other somehow. So composability eventually, like you want everything to be interconnected. The value transfer component of it is super important, but we've already started to see how composability can be made redundant. So for example, have you been following what's happened with the Fei protocol recently?
Yeah,
When they the merger. A lot of community members were confused because they were like, I thought the whole point of DeFi was to be composable so that we don't need to absorb, or some would say cannibalize, another project in order to bring those features into ours, because they were already available. And that is, I'd say there's a lot of wisdom to that observation. But the counter argument is that if you're always relying on another protocol to do functions for you, then what you have is a dependency in your system that you don't control. And any of the Linux users out there will know just how bad these dependency trees can get. Sometimes it is better to reorganize everything and have a stable release of something, rather than just count on the fact that some other functionality that someone else is controlling is going to be there for forever, right? You don't know what those other projects are going to be doing. They might actually inadvertently open up a security risk, or maybe the project gets bored and no one uses it, and now a key element of your value proposition is now fading away, things like that. So I don't see these things as being mutually exclusive. I think we need composability, but we also need protocols to be as flexible as they can.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's very interesting because I think that ties back to, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's completely separate, but it makes me start thinking about who will be the middleware that actually will allow for you to find the better opportunities,
Yeah.
protocol to protocol, from your own project, or who will identify that a particular protocol is down for some reason. And so it'll reroute your users to a different one, right? Yeah, I think there's a lot there. And I've had you guys on for a very long time. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole as desperately as I'd like to right now. I had a couple more questions, and this is the questions that every project dreads. But what's our timing on dawn, sunrise, and daylight, if you have them in general?
We have timing on dawn, and it will be in Q1.
Okay.
Yeah, right around the corner, and we're getting very, very close.
And those four primary components are pretty sexy, I think, for everybody in terms of, I realize you guys think the really juicy stuff happens in phase two, but I think the phase one stuff is also sounds very powerful. And I think it's going to be exciting for the market.
Yeah, it's super strong, right? All of the major pain points of version 2.1 are evaporating. Like I do think that's in and of itself is such an important development. Yeah, I agree.
Now, let me ask you guys a quick question. In in the halls of Bancor, in the virtual halls of Bancor, do you guys have a sense of kind of, I know you all have been transacting a lot of volume and been active, but in terms of presence in the DeFi space, do you guys feel like the reason you named them Dawn and Sunrise and Daylight not only was that you think you're going to transform DeFi, but also for the protocol itself to reinvent or reintroduce itself to the world of DeFi? Is that kind of where internally you guys are thinking about it?
That sounds like a marketing
Yeah,
question, mate.
there's no question. And there's also no question we have a big chip on our shoulder.
Nice.
We Bancor was the first DeFi protocol created, potentially the the key and core building block of the entire space, and is routinely overlooked.
Yeah.
And this is something that I could talk for hours about, whether it's us showing Vitalik the AMM model that we had and him wanting us to use ETH in the pools and then funding Uniswap and all the and then promoting Uniswap and all the regulatory stuff that we couldn't talk about in the beginning and just recently started getting clarity on. And so there's 1,000 reasons we can talk about why Bancor was first, but it doesn't matter who's first. It matters who offers the best product. We think today we do offer the best product and the most sound economics and protocol. And still the Bancor is just routinely overlooked.
Yeah.
And so I fully agree with you, Brad, that this is a coming out party for us. We have some folks on the marketing side and then having brilliant minds like Mark leading research and coming up with these incredible designs, scaling the number of full-time contributors on the engineering side and be able to moving faster, eventually going to different chains and L2s, and also having our pool tokens be composable, whereas in V2.1, they weren't composable. They were in our protection contract. Now we can do all these really amazing integrations with other protocols, which I think will help us get us back in the conversation. Compared to where we were in 2019 and how much we were getting ignored back then, I think now Bancor is a little bit more in the conversation. And I see the V3 will be a big coming out moment for us. Remind folks who we are and why these designs are so impactful. So I'm quite excited for it. And yeah, Mark, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think that it's like many users have already noted that we're taking a much more active approach to like things like marketing and branding. And I do think that this was something that I don't want to say that was neglected because it makes it seem like it was not deliberate, but we were quiet during all of version 2.1. And the reason is that we were still studying in many ways, version 2.1 was a prototype. We were still in that sort of development cycle of trying to build something bigger and better, and we weren't as excited for it yet because we knew that it was an incomplete product. It was unfinished. Whereas Bancor version 3 is really starting to feel like more of that initial market offering, which sounds counterintuitive because it's like, wasn't version 2.1 already out in the market? It's like, yeah, it was, but it was more like a test environment. And what we have learned during that phase of the development cycle is it has massively informed version 3. And version 3, I would say, is the thing that we always wanted to release. It is the finished draft, so to speak. It's a much stronger presence, and I think that we will be owning it in a much more positive way.
And
Go ahead, Nate.
I just wanted to add to that. I think the market is also maturing on the education side. There's 30, let's say, $billion locked up in AMM pools. And the vast majority of people providing that liquidity don't really understand impermanent loss and don't realize that the tokens they provided, if one of them goes up, they're going to be selling it off and pulling out less than if they just held it. So this very elusive concept of impermanent loss, the market is really starting to understand that. And we're starting to build up the tooling to expose the data behind it. We just released a study about a month or two ago that showed that in Uniswap V3, upwards of 50% of liquidity providers are actually suffering negative returns on their provided liquidity. So would have been better off just holding their assets in their wallet than providing it to the pool. And so this is a huge risk that a lot of people don't realize is so hard to calculate. And it's not really in the interest of the AMMs that expose users to this to make it easy for users to see their P&L. But we're seeing a lot of interesting tools like revert.finance is one of them, where you can plug in your address and see your P&L and which is your fees minus the IL and see if you're up or down. We also just released a tool called il.wtf, and you can put in your address and see your impermanent loss across all the pools you've ever provided to and which pools would burn you the most.
I don't think I even want to see that.
Make sure you're sitting down if you ever use it. Also, not associated with the WTF token in any way. I just
So my only point is that we've been waiting for the moment, not only for our product to get there, but also for the market to wake up and see that the APRs they see in most AMMs don't factor in impermanent loss. They're not real APRs. On Bancor, when you see an APR, that is what you're getting. We insure against this IL risk. We think a protocol is better positioned to manage IL risk than individual users for a number of reasons. And I think this confluence of all these events will hopefully lead to a massive sort of release for us.
Nice. Now I think that's an awesome angle from a messaging perspective for you to take, is that, yes, I think a majority of the users in the space are flying blind, and creating tools that reveal that to them and also allow them to see the benefits of what you're producing is a really good strategy. I love that. Twos and multi-chain.
Yeah, one of the factors that we haven't really hit on yet is the fact that Bancor version 3 contracts are actually smaller than the Bancor version 2.1, right? It's a lot, like the lightweightness of it is something else that we've been actively managing. And this is partly to make it easy to move between different environments, including layer 2s and layer 1s. This will be a DAO decision, and I can tell you which way the wind is blowing on that, but we can't make that decision for the DAO, right? Whatever they decide is whatever they decide. But it looks like a lot of our users are pretty active on Avalanche,
Okay.
which is probably good news. Honestly, like Avalanche is, I think, the P chain, or I always forget what the letters are.
See,
But
yeah.
I think it's PX and SEEB, and one, if not all of them, are fully EVM compatible. So it should be relatively straightforward to port the contracts over there. In terms of layer 2 stuff, it's a pretty mixed bag. I'd say that we've got a pretty big Polygon user base still, and that's also nice for us, because I think what a lot of people forget when they get excited about new chains and new environments to put this thing is that you still need to go somewhere that wants a liquidity protocol. So there was a small but devout Cardano following inside the Bancor community last year that wanted to move the Bancor contracts to Cardano. And I remember telling them, like, what are you going to do when you get there? We offer BNT versus ADA only, because it doesn't really have any other liquid assets. Yeah. So it doesn't matter how much you like the chain, there still needs to be a reason to be there. And then the same thing was true of BSC. A lot of people were super excited for how cheap and BSC was, and the centralization component notwithstanding, it still looked like a pretty decent chain to go on, especially the fact that it's basically a full fork of Ethereum. Problem there was, I was like, okay, once we get there, what tokens do you want to whitelist? And people were like, like this, there was BSC had a pretty rocky start with regards to all of the very poor quality projects that was getting started there. And so it's not even the case that there need to be new tokens there, but also there need to be tokens that we think are worthy of being insured, things that have a long-term value proposition and are associated with a project team that is committed to seeing the project goals to fruition. And in some chains, you just can't make that assumption, and that's a shame. Yeah. And so I'd say that in terms of layer 1s, alternative layer 1s, Avalanche, like personally, is giving me a little bit of sort of BSC vibes. I think that their what do they call it, Rush program, where they've incentivized people to launch new DeFi applications there. It's brought in quantity but not quality. A lot of it is direct copy paste of existing projects from Ethereum onto Avalanche, which is, maybe that's fine as long as they're copy pasting projects that are good. Then you could make the argument that those products are going to continue to function well on Avalanche. But the thing that it forgets is that those teams that developed those first products are still working on them. And so if you're just porting those contracts, you're not really owning the development side of things, which is usually the most difficult component. So I wonder if a lot of those protocols are going to represent a time capsule of what Ethereum was towards the end of 2021. And there might not be a huge amount of development on a lot of those forks. but I'm happy to be proven wrong. And so far, the amount of, let's say, criminal behavior on Avalanche has been pretty small compared to what BSC was experiencing. So I'm not too concerned about Avalanche. Like I said, a lot of our community adores it, so it's likely that they will vote that way, but I'm not sure. We've also got a lot of the more mature components of our network are really bullish on Solana. And I think that what Solana has that Avalanche doesn't seem to have yet, or is still in the process of establishing, is a lot of native innovation. People that established their project there from scratch and have continued to develop. And it's got that culture of innovation and development. Problem with Solana though is that it's using a completely different programming language. We need to port everything from
Rust.
to Rust, exactly, which is not terrible, by the way. That should never be considered a blocker, but it means that it would be slower and a little bit more cumbersome. The other problem that like blockchains like Solana and Cardano have, but also some of the roll-ups like Arbitrum, is that the way that the simultaneity of a lot of transactions means that some of the protections that we've introduced and that a lot of dexes have introduced will no longer function. So like the blocks can be mined out of order on Arbitrum, which would mean that you need a sequencer, and Arbitrum has its own sequencer that we can use and things like that. But it's another technical challenge. Polygon, for example, doesn't have that. You can just port whatever you've got and it will continue to work as normal. So yeah, I'd say that there are like the low-hanging fruits, and I think Polygon as a layer 2 and Avalanche as a layer 1 are probably what's going to happen. If I was to try and make a prediction, I would say that's probably what the community is going to decide. However, I have also noticed that the community is getting super excited for Phantom right now.
That was going to be what I was going to bring up next.
Yeah, and I think Phantom's quirky. It's got that kind of Halloween theme for everything that it does. There's a lot of native developers there. It hasn't had that kind of incentive cycle that's brought in a lot of white noise. It's more organic. I quite like that chain. And it's also very EVM compatible, so it would be easy for us to port there. Yeah. So I'm not sure. I would say that if we had to choose between one of these layer 1s, Avalanche, Solana, or Phantom, it looks like a pretty close race between Phantom and Avalanche, but we'll see.
I'm a big fan of Avalanche and Phantom more currently. And one of the primary drivers for me is their community. I have been just thoroughly impressed with how seriously they take growing the community, as well as the teams I've interviewed there. So anyway, one more question, and then I have actually 2 more questions. One question I ask everybody. Do you guys have any partnerships that you're currently working on for the version 3 launch, or is there anything cool coming up that you can talk about in that regard?
We have quite a few, actually dozens, teams or protocols that have indicated that they'll be running rewards on their pools. That'll be an awesome way to deploy the protocol, is having all these well-known DeFi protocols, having rewards, BNT rewards on those, and then also the IO protection and fees.
That's great.
I'm trying to think of other things that we can.
Yeah, I don't have any of the documents in front of me because I know that there's some stuff that's kind of under NDA. But what I can say is that it's not necessarily just token teams wanting to release their own rewards and help with IL protection and stuff. So if you wanted to maybe just quickly after this call or something, have a look at the proposal on our governance for the Shiba girlfriend token, which is like the first meme token to be taken seriously by Bancor. And the reason is that they're offering to cover their own impermanent loss protection, which is a huge advantage of version 3 that we didn't discuss. But we also offer projects the ability to provide funds to protect their own liquidity providers, which takes a massive burden off of the Bancor's protocol, and also makes it easier for the DAO to whitelist tokens that have extreme upside potential, which is where the overwhelming majority, it's like a short, right? The downside is always limited, but the upside is unlimited. And so if they're providing their own tokens to compensate liquidity providers as they withdraw, then the cost of offering impermanent loss protection is dramatically lower for Bancor. And so Shiba, and so Shiba girlfriend was like, yes, we'll do it. We're like, that's great. We're really excited for it. So there's these partnerships, right, where we know the token project and they want to provide rewards and external IL protection and all of that stuff, and that's great. But then there's the stuff that's closer to the hardware, where people actually want to use the Bancor protocol for their product, where we become part of that base layer, the primary producer, if you like, for DeFi. And so there's a lot of those as well. And I'm pretty sure I'm not allowed to talk about any of them, but just be aware that there are those things. There are other
Makes
protocols
sense.
that are being tasked with what to do with users' funds. And for a lot of them, the feedback that we get is that Bancor is such a no-brainer for the majority of their stuff. They can't, given a fiduciary responsibility that they give themselves,
Yeah.
a huge proportion of what they have, it should be on Bancor because it's just so risky trying to do something else with it.
That
Well,
makes total sense. Go ahead, Nate.
we saw this narrative in DeFi 2.0 emerge that it's these solutions for DAOs, right? Like a protocol for other protocols. And I brought up this the other day and we talk about it a lot. I think a lot of the trade-offs of what many folks understand as protocol owned liquidity are starting to show, whereas you're selling your tokens at a discount to acquire pool tokens. Those pool tokens you're acquiring are also exposed to impermanent loss. So they can also bleed your treasury, especially if the protocol token is rising in value. I would have been just better off for the protocol to hold on to its tokens instead of selling them at a discount for pool tokens. And then you look at Bancor as a sort of protocol owned or DAO treasury solution, and a protocol can just take its treasury, provide it, have it be protected from impermanent loss, not have to provide the other side of the pair, right? So they can get maximum capital in there when they're just providing their asset. And then in three, they get this out of box solution to cover IL if they want to run auto compounding rewards on their pool if they want to. So we really do, even at this stage, think Bancor is a sort of ultimate solution for DAO treasuries. And we've seen quite a few DAOs provide their treasuries to our pools, everyone from Yearn to Keeper DAO to Harvest Finance. Probably upwards of a dozen DAOs have provided close to, I think, 20 million in liquidity to their own pools. And we think that'll just increase in V3, and it comes full circle. We started as a community currency protocol. We started as a solution, a liquidity solution for new and emerging currencies. And then in 2017, for currencies that didn't want to just list or didn't have the resources or connections to list on a centralized exchange. And now fast forward to today, and this idea of a liquidity solution or a solution for DAOs is really taking shape. And it's really comes full circle with the evolution of our protocol and the space.
That's great. You made me think of another question. Sorry. Back to that Shiba girlfriend example. Will it be at some point that tokens willing to provide the insurance will actually be able to permissionlessly utilize Bancor? Or is that something that's always going to be an approval process by
We're,
the DAO?
we've all, yeah, at the moment, let's just say it will always require an approval process. And I don't mind. I think that it's almost like a proof of work.
Right.
That kind of legitimizes the project a little bit, whereas the permissionless stuff, you can never be so sure. The part of the DAO process is we check for things like rebasing mechanisms. We need to make sure that transfers are on or unidirectional. It means that there will never be a bad honeypot experience on Bancor, and we want to keep it that way. But yeah, it is possible that in the future we can have something similar to a launch pad. That's
what was my next question.
Yeah. And we've been researching this for such a long time, and you were right to identify that the external IL protection was a big component of that. And so like originally we'd spoken about, like Nate and I in March and April of last year, we're talking about an idea that we had for something called origin pools, which would be how you start on Bancor before in a limited whitelisting status, before upgrading or graduating to full whitelisting status. A lot of those ideas have been pulled apart and reorganized and become a part of version 3 just natively. And the external IL protection is the biggest component of that. But we still have other ideas of how to make it more permissionless. The problem is that once you start playing with that permissionless game and considering the insurance that the protocol affords you, you end up with, it's very easy to demonstrate potential attacks that would make something like this very difficult to manage. But never say never. We're constantly trying to figure it out. And I do think I already have a bunch of answers to some of these things. It just feels like whack-a-mole sometimes, where you build a solution that you're convinced can't be exploited because you've been focusing on one potential exploit. And then what you've done actually is reveal another obscure attack vector and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, it is important to us. It's very difficult to do it in a way that is on brand, I would say. That feels like you're actually benefiting from the Bancor experience. And so, yeah, I want to do it. There's no way I'm going to commit to it unless I know that it's safe. And that's going to take some time.
Well, I mean, I could even see you guys partnering, utilizing the protocol with, so example, one of the top notch in terms of people and processes on Avalanche is Avalanche. Avalanche, yeah. Really impressive team, really good track record. Like you could potentially partner with newly launching projects that are
Yeah, yeah.
already going through diligence on those projects to provide it in another brand format, Bancor launch or something, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. And like recently I spoke to the founder of a protocol called Juicebox. Yeah, and so Juicebox is, I would say, a huge force for good in the sense that they've got a framework and policies up to make it to do a responsible token launch.
yeah.
And as WTF has demonstrated just last week, that this is hard to do, right? If you just drop a bunch of tokens on everyone, it can lead to chaos. And so kind of getting legs underneath a token such that you're not going to financially ruin people that want to be involved is a huge challenge. And so during that conversation, I basically said, look, these are the requirements for whitelisting on Bancor. Maybe when a token's getting mature enough that it's looking to establish liquidity elsewhere in the ecosystem, just here's a collection of our documents, and if they want to educate themselves, they can approach the Bancor DAO and say, look, we've been on Juicebox for this long, and this is what the token distribution already is, and this is what our project is, and we would like to petition for whitelisting. I think that's a really healthy way to do stuff. And I referred to before as a proof of work because that's really how I see it. We're trying to filter out the stuff that is illegitimate somehow. And that's always going to require some human element. And there are these other launchpad protocols that are providing that human element. And so we can create a graduation system. Like you could consider, for example, I don't know, like Juicebox and MakerDAO. Sorry, not MakerDAO, Maker. I've got to stop doing that. DAO Maker to be like the token kindergarten, and when they're getting ready for a bigger stage, the Bancor could easily be that next logical progression for them. So yeah, it's an open question. I've got no idea whether or not we should offer our own products specifically to cater to these kinds of new projects, or continue to rely on projects that are already doing that. It's really, this is one of the more difficult components in our system to come up with a definitive conclusion for. And I think that we'll have to just wait and see how things evolve. Maybe the process I've just described is going to be good enough. Maybe it won't. But yeah, we're always thinking about it.
Yeah, it feels like after this interview that Bancor is it's going to be seen as the biggest unintentional secret that DeFi didn't know it had. I'm hopeful that you guys are going to get the full launch and attention you deserve. So a question I ask everybody, Nate, I'll let you go first, is who is someone or a project within DeFi that you either have incredible respect or awe for, or you think is just absolutely critical for the future from your perspective personally?
Oh, we have an economist on our team who comes from a TradeFi background. His name's Stefan Loesch. Used to run the options trading desk at one of some major banks in the space. BP Paribas is one. He floats around. He's not exclusively Bancor, and he's a big thought leader in the space, and he helps us design a lot of our economics. And so I would say he is one person I definitely admire. I'm super happy to have him involved in Bancor, and I think will be the sort of grown up in DeFi circles for some time to come. He's running actually a certification system for a lot of folks in TradeFi to learn about DeFi, and writing a book on AMMs, among other things. So I'd say he's someone I'd point to as someone I'm super glad to have in the space.
I'll take a deeper dive into him.
Yeah. So I think there are kind of three individuals that I want to talk about. And so I'll make it super fast there. I think Andre Cronje is super inspirational. I really like the, by the way, that Andre's kind of dark on DeFi all the time. Like,
Yeah.
you've got to appreciate someone that is actively building stuff and then being self-critical all the time. I think that in a way that it appeals to the scientist component of my training, because you never want to be, you're always trying to prove yourself wrong. You're never trying to prove yourself. And so that element that Andre has is, I think it's rare. It shouldn't be, but it is. And I think that he does it well. And I also think that the way that he manages to remain dark on so many things and still manage to inspire so much excitement at the same time, it's a fine balance. And I would like to be able to do the same, to manage my message, right, on that same sort of knife edge that he does.
Yeah.
I also have tremendous respect for Arthur 0x from Defiance Capital.
Yeah.
I'd say that he's one of the few people from the big fund scene that has a sober look on things, right? If you dig into his just recent tweets, he likes to remind people that no matter how far down you go, there's a potential another 90% downside. He's been in crypto for so long and he just understands it. He's not a hype machine. I don't see him as fueling the euphoric fire. And I don't think that he's here to exploit anything. I don't think that in general, Defiance Capital, I don't think is motivated exclusively by greed. I think that they are actively looking to support things that they believe in. And if you listen to some of Arthur's podcasts, I think that you would agree with me that he really does seem to be passionate about the scene and about being a general positive force within it. So I have, for these two individuals, I have tremendous amounts of respect, and I'm so glad that they're as active as they are. With regards to more the kind of thing that I'm doing every day in designing Bancor's products, the person that I'd say I draw the most inspiration from is Bancor's ex-chief economist, Bernard Litter. So he's the co-creator of the euro. So before he worked with Bancor, he was responsible for creating the euro, the European currency. And it's interesting that he went from that model to community currencies so quickly. But if you have a look at some of he's got a couple of books out and he's very quotable, right? If you just Google his name, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff that he said. But he is known for this idea that if you consider that finance is not really like a property of the universe, it's something that has come from our civilization, and it could have taken any one of an infinite number of forms. What do you think the probability is that society landed on the optimum form of finance immediately out of the gates? Right? Like people take it for granted that there can be only one financial system, or that the financial system that we have has been systematically optimized or something over time. But it's just not true. The finance can be anything that we want it to be. And it is a mistake to think that what we have today is optimal or even good. And so to try and replace it with something else is extremely sane, right? The chances of accidentally arriving at something that is orders of magnitude more efficient than what we currently have is pretty high. I think that any movement at all is likely to arrive at a better answer than the one that we currently have. And yeah, I think that idea is always at the heart of what I'm trying to design, right? Is come up with something new, something that it's okay to break paradigms, I think, and challenge that sort of incumbent complacency of finance. I think it's a dangerous idea that it should be respected. I would rather do something disruptive. And Bernard Litter is an economics academic that came to that same conclusion. So I'm very happy to say that he's probably among the most influential people that's guiding what I do on a day-to-day basis.
All four of those answers from you guys are really, really good. And I think they really speak to the overall culture that you guys have at Bancor. So I think that's very interesting. What's the best way to reach out to you guys, Nate?
Sure. My DMs are open on Twitter at Nate Hindman, and also at Nate Hindman on Telegram, or on email, nate@bancor.network.
Yeah, for me, I always forget what my Twitter ad is, but you can Google my name and find it. But yeah, if you want to reach out to me directly, probably email is best. It's mark@bancor.network. And yeah, I use my real name on all of my socials. So if you see me in Telegram, it is my name, and The same on Twitter.
Excellent. Gentlemen, this was so enlightening, fantastic. I'm excited for Bancor, excited for you guys. You all must be just ready to bust because of everything that you're about to do. Congratulations and best of luck to you in the next few months. And let's follow up in maybe 6 months or so and things, see how things are going. And maybe we'll get a little more detail on phase two at that point.
It's been a pleasure, Brad. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.